Okay, we all got that. That's great. Thank you so much. Welcome to today's call. It's a briefing session, and we're so pleased you could make it. We know your time and attention is very precious, and we hope this hour together is fruitful. So my name is Mo, and I organise with Abolitionist Futures, and I also work in the voluntary sector. So while we try our best to look slick at Abolitionist Futures and organised, we're actually just people trying to do this in our spare time, and we're unfunded. Sometimes we work with people and extract some resources to get some things done. And in this case, we're really pleased to work with Newcastle University and the other people who came on board to work with this on this resource specifically. So this is the first time we've ever done a briefing event in this way, and we wanted to have a different type of space for people working in the sector to understand the process and thinking that has gone into this resource that we're producing before we have the public launch event, which is on June the 4th. And so far we've had 194 people registered. So that's kind of partly why we want to have this kind of conversation in a smaller group. And we also hope that you can help us to promote the event and the following discussion groups. So I'll just explain how we'll be spending our hour together. Leah, Nikki and Molly, who've all been part of the group of people who've contributed to the resource, will give an overview of the introduction, an overview and introduction to the resource, who we are and why we made it, and what we hope it will do out in the world. Tina will then facilitate our question and answer section. And like I said, we really want us to spend some time talking together. And then I'll be back for the next steps. And in the meanwhile, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Leah, Nikki and Molly.
Thanks, Mo. I'll start just by introducing myself, and then Nikki and Molly will introduce themselves as well. My name is Leah. I currently work as an advisor at a charity that is supporting migrant families with no recourse to public funds who are facing homelessness and destitution. And these are primarily women with young children, many of whom are experiencing gender-based violence and are made more vulnerable to violence due to the nature of the hostile environment and the border regime. And I previously worked in the gender-based violence sector at IMCON, which many of you will know. It's the UK's only national Black feminist umbrella organisation dedicated to addressing violence against Black and minoritised women and girls. And before that, I worked at the End Violence Against Women Coalition, which is a group of feminist organisations and experts from across the UK who are working to end violence against women and girls. And I'll hand over to Molly and Nikki to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Leah. So yeah, I'm Molly. I currently work as a researcher focusing on kind of sexual violence and justice, but have around a decade, which is wild, of experience working in the sexual violence sector and also kind of supporting women and girls more generally. So I started by my kind of career working in harm reduction with sex working women and girls before working on the National Sexual Violence Support Helpline, then as an outreach worker with Rape Crisis Surrey and Sussex, and then as an ISFA at Rape Crisis South London before moving on to Survivors UK on their helpline as well. That's me. I'll hand over to Nikki.
Hi everyone, I'm Nikki. I'm a senior lecturer in law at Newcastle University. Is around sexual violence law and justice, and in this capacity I've worked with survivors and organisations in the gender-based violence sector and lawyers who represent survivors. But outside of my academic work, I've also done work with the GBV sector. Most recently, I've been a trustee for Rape Crisis Tyneside and Northumberland since 2016, though I've recently changed from that role and I'm working with them in more of like an advisory capacity around different areas of policy and practice. So over to Leo, who's going to talk a bit more about who we are as a group and why we made the resource.
Thanks, Nikki. So this resource was developed by Abolitionist Futures. Mo's done a bit of an intro for Abolitionist Futures in collaboration with frontline support workers, community organisers and researchers. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of what the resource is and how it works. So it's devised primarily as a discussion tool for addressing gender-based violence in ways that don't rely on police and prisons for safety. And it does this by looking at carceral reforms and abolitionist strategies for addressing gender-based violence. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by those two things. So by carceral reforms for addressing gender-based violence, I mean an approach which sets out to address gender-based violence, but kind of ends up expanding the harms of the criminal legal system, including things such as policing, incarceration in prisons and immigration detentions, etc. And by abolitionist strategies for addressing gender-based violence, we're talking about a holistic approach to addressing violence that doesn't expand or entrench existing systems of harm. And abolition is both a political vision and a practical project for building collective safety and well-being for all of us without relying on punishment, violence, and oppression. So abolitionist strategies for addressing gender-based violence instead encourage the growth of life-affirming institutions, practices, and communities that set the scene for well-being and harm reduction for all of us. And this includes things like reducing the scope, the scale, and the funding that are channeled into the criminal legal system and the laws that criminalize survival, alongside at the same time also building harm reduction and harm prevention skills and programs that are held by our communities as part of a wider journey towards building long-term economic and social justice. And we decided to create this resource because following the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there's been a real kind of growing interest in abolitionist practices here in the UK. And this interest very much builds on a long history of abolitionist thinking and activism. And this moment has brought abolitionist ideas more into the mainstream. But there's a common question when people first learn about abolition, and this is, what about gender-based violence? How does this fit into it? And how do we address harms without turning to institutions such as the police and prisons? And so we got together because we wanted to share some thinking on some practical answers to these questions. From my own experience of working with survivors and also more broadly organising around the harms that people experience at the hands of the state, for example, through the border regime, I've often struggled to reconcile more carceral responses to gender-based violence that see the police and prisons as kind of good solutions with the expressed needs and lived realities of many survivors. So in my experience and the experience of the people I've worked with, many of whom are from racialized or migrant communities, interactions and engagements with the criminal legal system has often led to more harm rather than less. And fear of engagements and potential outcomes of these interactions have created sites of vulnerability and exploitation. And these interactions have all entrenched cycles of harm and poverty for them and their loved ones and their wider communities. So it's my kind of experience of these common contexts that motivated my participation in building this resource. And lots of the people working on this resource came to the project with similar kind of positions of experience and understanding as well. And just a final point to kind of explain more practically. So the resource has two parts. One is a chart that compares carceral reforms and abolitionist strategies for addressing gender-based violence. And then the other part is a booklet that explains each strategy in a bit more detail and considers the strengths and the pitfalls of different approaches. And as I said, this resource is very much designed as a discussion tool, a kind of starting point for people to take away and discuss with other people. It certainly doesn't provide all of the answers, but it hopefully offers some suggestions for all of us to consider. And I'll hand over to Molly to give us a bit more detail on that.
Great. So yeah, as Leah spoke to, the resource kind of really arose from some really solid understandings that kind of all of us involved in creating it and writing it had about the ways in which the criminal legal system just so routinely fails survivors in a kind of manifold of ways. And I'm sure that all of you within the room will kind of, or can attest to kind of doing support work where you've seen the kind of promises of justice and safety given to survivors in the ways that that system just so frequently wasn't able to give them that, and then also caused more harm to them. And it's because of this that a really key part of the chart, which Leah mentioned, is kind of carefully pulling apart all of the ways in which certain strategies make the criminal legal system bigger and others make them smaller. And the way we've mapped this is by kind of breaking down whether kind of this kind of host of strategies, one, increases funding to the police, two, increases the scope of police and prison power, and three, kind of furthers the idea that the kind of police and prisons kind of equates to and equals and fosters safety. And perhaps more importantly, we've also charted whether certain strategies increase safety and support, and kind of also reduce harm. And where strategies increased police and prison funding, power, and ideas that these systems kind of equaled safety but didn't actually lead to safety, we labelled them carceral reforms, like Leah's spoken to. And you may also have seen that there are some parts of some strategies where it's not so clear cut, where we haven't said yes or no, and we've noted it depends. And that was also really important for us to do. And in the booklet, we've also placed the carceral and abolitionist strategies that most mirror each other next to one another. It's not always kind of as clear cut, but we've tried to do it as in that way. And kind of alongside that, for both carceral and abolitionist strategies, we've also provided examples of that strategy in the booklet to make it really useful. And for carceral strategies, we've expanded on why that strategy is harmful, who is affected, and kind of for abolitionist strategies, we also outlined the strategy's purpose as well as some of the potential pitfalls. Again, that felt really important to recognise. Kind of an example of how this works in the resource and in the booklet is kind of police reforms, which we've labelled a carceral strategy, and non-police based crisis intervention teams, which we've labelled an abolitionist strategy. Where kind of police reforms, and so that's things like training the police, increase funding and scope and scale of police and prisons without kind of actually kind of increasing safety. Non-police based crisis intervention teams like kind of peer support, crisis lines do the opposite. Kind of we did, however, note that kind of this kind of abolitionist strategy doesn't always increase or kind of necessarily reduce harm, but to do that kind of relies on those interventions also being punitive. So wanted to, again, add some complexity to what we were putting in there. There were some in there that, yeah, we really struggled around. So kind of, for instance, we listed institutional safeguarding and mandatory reporting as a kind of carceral reform. And that's not because we don't believe in the importance of the kind of ethic of care and support that for so many of us on this call will be kind of what is central to a safeguarding praxis, but because of what safeguarding does in practice and what it emboldens. And as the resource outlines, kind of one example of this is kind of how ideas of safeguarding people from things like female genital mutilation and modern slavery have been used to further the hostile environment to massive adverse effects to certain demographics of people, and the kind of way in which, yeah, safeguarding has directly harmed many of those that we've supported. And this is why we prefer to think of prevention-focused education in line with kind of things like Maslow's fantastic work on radical safeguarding, which is one of the resources that we've referenced. I don't know if I'll go into any more detail on some of the other ones, but we can maybe talk about some of them in questions. Instead, maybe I'll just hand over to Nikki now, who will speak a little bit more about how we hope people will use this resource more widely.
So like we've said already, we know the resource doesn't provide all the answers, and that's not really what we're intending it to do as such, but we hope it provides a tool for discussion and a way to get people thinking differently about the different strategies for addressing and reducing gender-based violence. So we hope it will be used by you and others working in the gender-based violence sector, but as well like anyone who works with and supports survivors. We also think in terms of kind of thinking about the discussion and what it might then lead to, is thinking like more practically how these conversations might influence decision making about, you know, what types of policy changes or practices that you might either choose to engage with or choose not to engage with, or it might shape the way in which you decide to approach a particular issue, whether that's within the sector or outside the sector. or to kind of think about, you know, where activism energies are most best directed, for example. And, you know, we all know kind of how active and how impactful feminist activism and organising really can be. And we hope this resource can play a role in that, and kind of bringing people together and shaping the types of active action that we want to take, and the kinds of groups and communities that we want to build. But ultimately, what we hope the resource is doing is getting people to think about ways to reduce reliance on and reduce the scope and power of policing and the criminal legal system, while expanding alternative existing practices, as well as creating new ones which, you know, better meet the needs of all survivors and any groups or communities impacted or implicated with gender-based violence. So to carry on these discussions, we have a public launch, which you're all very welcome to attend. We have different speakers, so you're not just hearing from me, Molly, and here again. And we also have some discussion groups, some of which will be online and in person, which you're all very welcome to join as well. So thanks very much for listening. We've got plenty of time to have more conversations, have questions, or go into more detail about some of the suggestions and strategies that we've got in the resource.